My guest at this time is Andrew C. McCarthy. He is a former federal prosecutor and is also a contributing editor and columnist at National Review. He's also a Fox News contributor. He joins me now to discuss the legal realities surrounding Michael Cohen's guilty pleas and his assertion that President Trump conspired with him to pay off two women to keep silent about Trump's affairs with them, and in the process broke federal campaign law. And Andy, thanks so much for being with us.
Greg, it's my pleasure.
First of all, Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to 8 different crimes that could land him in prison for more than 5 years if given the maximum. What does that indicate to you that prosecutors might have been prepared to throw at him if he didn't accept the plea bargain?
Well, it's important to underscore here that this is not a cooperation agreement. He may end up deciding to become a cooperator. But when you said that he's looking at about 5 years in jail, that's under the federal sentencing guidelines. The statutes that he pled to actually add up, I think, to scores of potential years. But this was not the typical plea agreement for a cooperator where you basically make him eat every single conceivable count, and then his only way out is to cooperate with you, and then the prosecutor gets to file a motion at the end, which allows the judge to give him a light sentence. This was a straight guilty plea agreement with no cooperation component, and the 5-year range is not the statutory range, it's the sentencing guidelines.
You've written about this today, and I think you helped to clear up a lot of what's being discussed on the right and the left right now. You've got a lot of commentators out there, for example, especially on the right, saying, how can this be breaking the law when no actual campaign funds were touched? Why does it make such a big difference if Cohen paid these women and Trump paid him back, as opposed to Trump just paying them directly? It does matter, though. Explain why. Yeah,
well, the whole concept of an in-kind contribution, Greg, is the idea that this is not something that you would expend campaign money on, or maybe the way I should put it is it's the kind of thing you would expend campaign money on if somebody else didn't pay it by other means. So that's why it's an in-kind contribution. If you're doing an expenditure, the purpose of which is designed, at least in part, to lighten the burden of the campaign, which would otherwise pay the same money, then it's a campaign contribution. So I don't really get the argument that it's not. I understand there are a number of mental element defenses here that I think may be actually compelling, but to argue over whether it's an in-kind contribution doesn't seem to me to be fruitful.
Yeah, you used the word mitigation in your story. That might have been the motivation here. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, I think that the president's best route here has always been not to deny, but rather to say, look, number one, these are campaign finance infractions. They are typically not treated as criminal prosecutions. In fact, the one we typically talk about is the 2008 Obama campaign, which had about $2 million worth of illegal contributions, which obviously dwarfs the amount of money that we're talking about in connection with these hush money agreements. And yet that was settled with a $375,000 fine to the Federal Election Commission. So what we're talking about here is not really the crime of the century, even if they could prove it against President Trump, which I think they probably couldn't. And secondly, when you're talking about the president, Greg, a sitting president under the Justice Department guidance is never going to be indicted while he is in office. So the real issue with President Trump, whenever there is a misconduct allegation, is really impeachment. And this is certainly not grist for what you would call high crimes and misdemeanors. I wouldn't be surprised if they could come up with actual high crimes and misdemeanors that you would throw this into the bundle. But as a standalone matter, nobody's getting impeached over a campaign finance violation. At least they shouldn't.
Oh, we're so polarized right now. I wouldn't be surprised if they tried, though. But as you point out in the article and in your book, Faithless Execution, which I highly recommend, this does become more of a political issue rather than a legal issue so long as he's in office.
Yeah, that's right. And, to your point about how politicized we are, the framers give us guidelines in terms of what high crimes and misdemeanors are. There's talk about them in the debates around the adoption of the Constitution. It's a term of art that they were obviously borrowing from British jurisprudence. It really addresses egregious offenses that go to the fiduciary responsibilities that a public official has to his office and the violation of his public trust. So we have guidelines and an understanding of what this term high crimes and misdemeanors means, but the Constitution still vests the authority completely in the House of Representatives, which is why when he was the head of the Republican Party in the House, Gerald Ford famously said that an impeachable offense is whatever the House of Representatives decides it is. That's a little bit of a cynical take on it, but there is something to be said for it in the sense that if they file articles of impeachment, it's not like somebody can run to federal court and get that reversed. It's really Congress's call.
Mm-hmm. Lanny Davis is the attorney for Michael Cohen, and there's been some reporting on Wednesday here, Andy, that he claims that he has evidence through Cohen, didn't really specify how, of Trump's supposed complicity in the plot to hack DNC emails. If he's telling the truth, how does that change the game?
Well, that's a big if. I don't mean to cast aspersions at Lanny. He may have one understanding of what Cohen says, and there could be other understandings. But I heard him say a little bit, and it seems to me that he's trying to be very careful the way he frames this. So there may be less here than meets the eye. My suspicion that there's less here than meets the eye owes to the fact that Cohen was originally Robert Mueller's case. That is, the special counsel had Cohen just like he has Manafort within the ambit of his investigation, and he transferred this case to the Southern District of New York. Very hard for me to believe that if Mueller, who has a lot more information than anyone else does about what proof he has of collusion, if he thought that Cohen was helpful to that case, I don't see him letting that case walk to the Southern District of New York. I think he would have kept it just like he kept Manafort. And
speaking of Manafort, you also make an important point in that article. You've got people wondering now that Manafort's been found guilty on 8 counts. He could be retried on the 10 there was a hung jury on. Plus, he's got another trial coming up in D.C. He's in a world of legal trouble, obviously, that he might be more willing to cooperate if he's got incentive to do so. And some people think that Trump's tweets from today, praising Paul Manafort essentially for not cracking like Cohen did, is basically encouraging him to not speak on anything that Trump might want him not to speak on. But as you point out in the piece, much like with Michael Cohen, Mueller's had Rick Gates, who was, of course, the star witness against Manafort. And you would think that if Manafort had anything to spill to Bob Mueller, Rick Gates would have already done it.
Yeah, I haven't seen – this is part of why, Greg, I think it's foolish for the president and his team to continue to attack Mueller and Mueller's integrity the way they have. And I'm not, this isn't me stepping up to the plate for Mueller. I'm just talking about the strategy here. If I were the prosecutor and my honor was being attacked every single day, I would be motivated when my time finally came to file a report to write the report to end all reports. And I'm not saying that you make up information, but, there's a way of writing things when you want to sort of soft sell them, and there's a way of writing things when you want to be very aggressive. We've all seen that. And I think that, the president handling it this way is really motivating these guys to write a very scathing report. And it's not like they're not going to have some ammunition to work with. And the reason I don't see it is I don't think Mueller is trying to make a collusion case against the president. You mentioned Rick Gates has been cooperating with Mueller for 6 months. Let's think about what Mueller's done in the 6 months since Rick Gates has been a cooperator. He's filed 2 indictments against groups of Russians which don't come close to hinting that there's any complicity by the Trump campaign in Russia's perfidy in connection with the election. And the other thing I see Mueller doing since Gates became a cooperator is when he charges these cases, they're all being quietly farmed out to other Justice Department components. I think the troll farm case went to the Eastern District of Virginia. The Russian hacking case went to the Justice Department's National Security Division. That's not the kind of thing that a prosecutor does when he's gearing up for the big collusion case. It seems like this is winding down rather than building up to a crescendo. And it seems to me if I'm Mueller, I got to be sitting back there puzzled because, you know, he is conducting this investigation, which is not supposed to be principally about collusion. The main part of the investigation is Russia's interference in the election. And I think he's interested in Manafort because Manafort has extensive ties with Kremlin-connected operatives. And if you wanted to probe the threat that Russia poses to the United States, he'd be somebody you'd be interested in. But I think he's interested in Manafort for Manafort. I don't think he's interested in Manafort to try to make a case against Trump because I don't think he thinks there is one. On collusion, obstruction's a different story, but I just don't see this collusion with Russia thing happening.
And very important insights, Andy, especially for those, not to diminish cable news because I know you're a contributor now, but oftentimes nuance can be missing from some of these debates. And so your expertise on all these different topics is greatly appreciated. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Greg.
Andrew C. McCarthy, former federal prosecutor, contributing editor and columnist at National Review, and a Fox News contributor. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.